Iran will boycott the final FIFA World Cup draw next week in protest of the United States' limited visa allocation. Visas were granted to 4 members of the Iranian delegation, including the team's head coach, but one has not been given to the Iranian Football Federation president. Iran is calling the United States' actions unsportsmanlike. The US has had strict visa restrictions on the country for decades.
Donald Trump has encouraged the Iranian football team to stay away from the upcoming FIFA World Cup. Posting on Truth last night, the US president said that Iran is welcome at the World Cup, before adding that he doesn't believe it's appropriate that they may be there for their own life and safety. So, yeah, that's part of what he's read there. Earlier this week, the president told the FIFA boss Gianni Infantino that the Iranians would be welcome to compete at this year's tournament despite the ongoing conflict. On Wednesday, Iran's sports minister claimed the side could under no circumstances compete at the tournament.
The 2026 World Cup was supposed to be too big to fail. 48 teams. 3 host countries. Record revenues. Record crowds. A commercial machine stretched across the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And yet, with the tournament approaching, the real story is no longer just football. It is access. It is legitimacy. It is security. It is politics. And increasingly, it is geography. Because the more the US side of this tournament becomes politically combustible, the more Canada and Mexico start to benefit by comparison. Reuters reports that FIFA's chief operating officer said the World Cup is too big to be postponed despite the Middle East conflict, which tells you exactly how FIFA is framing the crisis, not in terms of moral legitimacy, but in terms of whether the event can still be commercially delivered. That matters, because once too big becomes the answer, the official question is no longer whether the event is damaged. It is whether the damage can be managed. And that is where the boycott story becomes much more complicated than one dramatic refusal. There are now at least 3 forms of boycott pressure surrounding the 2026 World Cup. First, the classic political boycott threat. Officials and public figures asking whether national teams should refuse participation over US conduct. Reuters reported in January that France's sports minister rejected a formal boycott over Trump's Greenland threats, and Germany also avoided endorsing one. So the state-level center of gravity in Europe is still caution, not rupture. Second, the fan boycott. Supporters deciding not to travel because of visa risk, border politics, security fears, or cost. Reuters reported this month that US lawmakers urged FIFA to lower prices, warning that dynamic pricing was turning the World Cup into an exclusionary event, and Reuters also noted that final tickets were reaching thousands of dollars. That means access is not only political. It is economic too. Third, the most explosive version of all. A qualified team refusing the US portion of the tournament. And this is where the Iran story comes in. It changes the dynamics. The earlier version of the crisis was Iran might not participate. But Reuters later reported a more precise and more politically revealing position. Iran would boycott America, but not the World Cup. Iran's football federation said it wants to keep preparing for the tournament while moving its matches out of the United States and into Mexico. That is a major development. Because it means the crisis is no longer just about whether a team withdraws. It is now about whether the internal geography of the tournament itself becomes contested. And that is exactly where this starts favoring Mexico and, more indirectly but still meaningfully, Canada. If a qualified team says, "We will play the tournament, but not in the United States," then the US is no longer just a co-host. It becomes the controversial core of the event. Mexico, by contrast, becomes the practical alternative. And once one non-US co-host becomes the safer or more acceptable venue in geopolitical terms, the whole balance of the tournament begins to shift. The same logic applies to Canada. Even if no matches move north, Canada gains by contrast. Because every story that makes the US side look more restrictive, more unstable, or more politically exposed makes Canada look more accessible, more predictable, and more legitimate as a host. That matters economically. It matters reputationally. And it matters symbolically. Reuters reports that security concerns are growing around the US side of the World Cup after months-long delays in dispersing a $625 million federal security grant, with intelligence briefings warning about extremist threats, transportation attacks, and civil unrest linked to immigration politics. At the same time, Reuters says international interest remains strong, with solid ticket sales and flight bookings. That combination is actually very revealing. The event may still succeed commercially while becoming more politically strained and operationally tense. And that is exactly the kind of environment that benefits Canada and Mexico. Why? Because they can remain inside the commercial success story without carrying the same symbolic burden. If the US hosts the final, the most politically charged matches, and the most security-sensitive fan environments, while Canada and Mexico are seen as calmer, more welcoming, or simply less entangled in war, politics and immigration enforcement, then the internal reputational map of the World Cup changes. Not on paper, but in perception. And perception is where a lot of the real value now sits. Think about what the World Cup actually sells. Not just football. It sells movement, travel, hospitality, gathering, fan density, spectacle, the feeling that the world has shown up. Once the US part of the event becomes associated with selective access, visa anxiety, possible anti-ICE unrest, delayed security preparation, and the possibility that at least one qualified team does not want to play there, then the World Cup product itself starts to split. The matches still happen. The broadcasters still show them. But the symbolic value stops being evenly distributed. That is how America loses ground while Canada and Mexico gain it. And Canada's advantage is especially interesting because it is quieter than Mexico's. Mexico gains in the obvious way. As the venue Iran may prefer, and as a culturally easier alternative for many fans. Canada gains in a more subtle way. Canada looks like the stable pole. The less controversial co-host. The North American venue still attached to the tournament's prestige but not attached to the sharpest layers of US immigration politics, US war entanglement, or the most visible security funding drama. That kind of contrast matters more than people think. It can reshape tourism decisions. It can reshape sponsor behavior around hospitality and events. It can reshape how global audiences remember who looked credible and who looked politically overloaded. That is what I mean when I say these developments disfavor America and favor Canada and Mexico. America still hosts the biggest slice of the tournament. It also absorbs the biggest share of the legitimacy crisis. That is not a good trade. And it gets worse when you look beyond the tournament itself. Reuters reported today that the Asian Football Confederation postponed the draw for the 2026 Asian Cup because of the continuing US-Israel-Iran conflict. That matters because it shows the World Cup controversy is no longer isolated. The broader football calendar is already being disrupted by the same geopolitical environment. That widens the frame. This is no longer just some people want to boycott the World Cup. It is a deeper question about whether global football can keep pretending that war, borders, and selective access are secondary concerns. FIFA still wants the old story. Football above politics. But the evidence keeps pointing in the opposite direction. Iran says it wants the tournament, but not the U.S.Venues. European governments reject a full boycott, but public mistrust remains active. Ticket pricing is making the event more exclusionary even before the border filter kicks in. Security planning in the US is under visible strain. And the wider football ecosystem is already being disrupted by the same conflict logic. That is not a normal pre-tournament controversy. That is a legitimacy problem. And once a tournament develops a legitimacy problem, the question is no longer just whether it can be staged. It can. The question becomes, what kind of event is it now? If the US remains the politically combustible heart of the competition, then Canada and Mexico do not need to replace it to gain. They only need to look steadier than it does. And right now, that is exactly what is happening. Mexico benefits as the plausible relocation or preferred venue for teams and fans who do not want the US leg of the tournament. Canada benefits as the quieter reputational winner, the co-host that looks more stable, more open, and less trapped inside the hardest contradictions of the event. That is how perception turns into economic asymmetry. Not by rewriting the fixture list overnight, but by changing where trust, comfort, and legitimacy seem to live inside the same tournament. So here is the real closing question. Will 2026 be remembered as the World Cup that survived every controversy? Or as the tournament where the United States kept the biggest share of the matches, but Canada and Mexico ended up looking like the more credible hosts? Because if that happens, then the World Cup will not just have exposed a legitimacy problem. It will have redistributed prestige inside North America itself. If you like the analysis, subscribe and hit the notification bell to get reminders of our subsequent analysis. See you in the next.